In the E case, aren't we talking about play optimization? The lower elo players that don't care for the control on Q really going to be harmed by that change? It depends on if you need to optimize to have fun on the character. Or I shouldn't say have fun, but to be powerful on the character. So as an example, I'll talk about it this way. Let's think about power budget, right? Let's say 90% of your power budget is in aha, lol, lamau, I click on a guy and do true damage, right? And 10% of your power budget is in I teleport to a dude. I'm making up numbers, but let's say that's the case, right? And then let's say we change the Q, so a lot more power budget on the characters around optimizing the Q, and that power budget needs to come from somewhere. So now it's like we change the Q, we reduce the true damage he's doing potentially, and now the Q is more versatile, but at the cost of lol, I click on you and deal true damage. So the end result of that, again, it could be good, could be totally fine, but the thing to note is that when you're adding optimizations to characters, when you're adding new ways to play, new ways to outplay, that character's power budget will need to account for those things, and sometimes that means that they will have to be nerfed in another way. And so with Master Yi's Q, it's like, okay, he's more versatile, but that probably means his just kind of like straightforward click on you power probably gets worse to account for that versatility. And so then it's like, then you would ask like a Silver Yi player, it's like, well, is a Silver Yi player going to be using that versatility? And if they don't use that versatility, how will they feel about the other pieces of power that they're accessing compared to how they might have felt about it before when those pieces of power might have been stronger? And yeah, it just depends. Different characters work differently, and some are going to be totally fine to buff and give skill expression to, and it won't really matter, and it'll be sweet. And some of them, if you give the skill expression to them, it could just make what people like about them a bit worse, which, you know, it just depends on the character. A more easy example of this, too, is what happens when a character shows up in Pro. Like, one of the things that we did with JINX and then went back on is, so fun fact, JINX wasn't in Pro for a while. She was like a less pro-skewed carry. Tended to be balanced at higher win rates. But was very popular. And then, eventually, JINX got to this spot where she was actually, like, for a number of seasons, like, fairly dominant in Pro if she, like, was, you know, very viable. And one of the reasons this was the case was we'd done a number of buffs to her to make her better for good players. Because naturally the thought was like, okay, well, if she's not very good for good players, like, we should make her good for good players, right? But the end result of all of that, the end result of making JINX good for good players, was she ended up showing up in Pro a lot, and we had to nerf her a lot for Pro, and she'd go many months at a time being significantly weaker for the average person who wanted to play her. And so during that time, you often saw JINX, sorry, brain going out. You often saw JINX being pretty low win rate and pretty low pick rate, compared to how she normally is, because of, you know, we're bouncing around Pro. And so then we ended up reverting a number of those changes we did to her that made her Pro skewed. Because we were like, oh, actually, it is probably not as great for this character to be as good for these high elo players due to the end result of how we have to tune her for everybody else. And so nowadays she's a mix. JINX is still a lot better in high MMR than she was, you know, 5 years ago, but she's not as good as high MMR as we initially placed her, because we kind of realized it was like, oh, hey, actually, this is pretty rough if she has to be balanced around only these high MMR players, given how many other people potentially want to play her. Can you chew your food before talking? Honestly, I should have. My bad. Can we buff Briar? She's probably definitely right now, like, fairly, like, weak compared to where she's been in the past. But it is hard to buff a character with a 51% win rate. My personal opinion is that 51% win rate is probably a representation of her being weak, given how straightforward she is. But it is hard to justify buffing a character with a 51% win rate. But she definitely is, right now, probably at one of the lowest win rates she's been in a long time, and also one of the lowest play rates. So there's probably something going on with her feeling, you know, she might be weak right now. But it's hard to justify buffing 51% win rate champions. Okay, why do you need to press to accept into queue? Doesn't it make sense to just load you into champion select like Valorant does? Because we don't want to load you into champion select if you're not ready to play the game. Right? Like, something very, very bad is if a game starts and people aren't ready to play it. Because, like, you don't want... And, you know, Remake exists, which is nice, but, like, it's probably not good to get people into a game that they're not ready to play, right? And so we tell people to accept the queue because we're like, okay, you need to be at your computer ready to play the game. And asking people to like be around to see the queue, I think is probably a better thing than like having, you know, games that start with somebody who's AFK. It's probably not great. Why do we get penalized for not accepting? You have to be penalized for not accepting because people can abuse it. And so obviously you're not going to be penalized if you don't accept once, but if you're chained not accepting queues, that can actually be really, really negative for the entire like queuing environment if someone's doing that. And so we need levers in place to ensure that people who would abuse that kind of thing can't do it. And if you're like, well, why would anybody do that? It's just a waste of time. It's like, there are some people out there who just like other people suffering. Like that's like their thing. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to just make others suffer. And your systems have to account for those people, unfortunately. Are you guys ever thinking of giving Vi a third ability instead of a passive? No. That would be unlikely. Doesn't mean it'll never happen. One of the reasons she has a third ability in Wildrift is Wildrift, you need an ability on each button. Like that's actually part of like how that game has to work to function on the to work on the phone in the right ways. And so in Wildrift, we put an ability on each button no matter what. But in League of Legends, you do not need an ability on each button. Some characters could just have less abilities, and it's just like at the end of the day, it's a question of, okay, we could give Vi a spell on her W, but would that make her a better character? Vi overall is kind of intended to be a fairly straightforward, offense is the best, defense, punch first, ask questions later kind of character, and her kit kind of like goes towards that. It's like, you're not really pushing a lot of buttons, you're queuing in, R'ing in, and then beating people up, and like that's kind of just what it is. And so, yeah, we could give her a button on W, you know, like she could have a shield or something, but that's more reactive power. There's more things that you can do with it then. It's just a question of like, is that the best version of Vi, given she's already like kind of in a specific spot of being a very straightforward to play character?